Evening. My name is Mark Michaelis. I am a software architect. I work for Intelitect. And traditionally, you guys know me for showing code. So quickly, let me do that just to make sure that we cover that base. Whoops, that changed my screen size. Oh, I might have a problem there. How do I get my screen back? Kelly, keyboard shortcut? Wow, this is good. This is impressive.
Up arrow. Hit the up arrow.
There we go. I pushed the wrong button. There we go. So just to make sure we can get some code. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Okay, so the reality of it is I'm not going to do any code. And so this is a little bit different than probably what you're expecting. And I've sort of got three objectives that I want to walk through and sort of challenge you with as we go back do this talk. The first one is I think we need to begin reflecting on sort of the future world rather than where we are today. And the reason that is because I think we're starting to see the technology world move at a velocity that is way faster than we've ever experienced before. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We need to realize that there's this inflection point, and by inflection point I mean that we're starting to see a change in either the speed or the types of technologies or the things that are happening in the world that is going to be radically transform what life is we experience today. And I think that's important for us as technologists to begin to reflect on in many ways, both from a perspective of how do we take advantage of it, but also in terms of how do we be cautious. And as we look at that world, what things do we need to be wary of and what things we should do in that area. And lastly, I think there's somewhat a challenge here that we need to embrace it. I don't think it's going to stop just because we've decided we want to sell buggy whips. It turns out that technology is going to move whether we want it to or not. And so there's an obligation on us as technologists to sort of say, how do we adopt and embrace what's happening, but also come at it with some level of control. And I think the biggest thing that I would sort of challenge you with is that you have a humanity or a human well-being mindset rather than a growth mindset. It might be both, but you have to approach it with a mindset that is towards human well-being. One of the things that I find interesting to reflect on is as we look at ourselves in the first world, how do we compare, are we that different from the Bill Gates of the world? And when I ask the question, I sort of go, well, talk about can I just jump in a jet and fly anywhere? Probably not. But in terms of our needs being met and whether we have satisfactory food, where we have more than we could possibly need or want, do we go out to eat more often than necessary, all those kinds of things. For a large part, our lives probably aren't that different. Clearly he's traveling differently and he's living at a different level, but in terms of our needs being met, we're relatively pretty satisfied. And so the question we begin to think about with all these things happening, is it all around just growth, we need so much more, or can we start to become a bit more human-centered in our thinking? So, question for you guys. What are the coolest technologies, coolest innovations that you see happening in the world today? So today's innovations. And I do have an adjective there specifically that says exponential. And I'll leave that as undefined for the moment. You can sort of imagine what that means. But ideas, what are the technologies or innovations that you guys have seen that are sort of capture your attention today? 3D printing, great. That's a great one. Very interesting. Okay, what else? Sean? Machine learning, excellent. Okay, great. Blockchain, excellent. Others? Open source, okay, great. That's very interesting. Great, I don't have that one. Other things? Sorry? Storage capacity, or energy storage capacity, excellent. Yes, very much so. And that's changing other industries as well, interestingly enough. Other stuff. Gene therapy, exactly, or bioengineering, or DNA sequencing, that kind of stuff. Absolutely, yes, very much so. Nanotechnology, there you go. So far it hasn't been cracked, but yeah, we're making progress. Another one in the similar space is quantum quantum computing, right? They started to see stuff happen there. The comment was fusion is still 30 years out. Yeah. That was his point. Yes, that was exactly his point. His point is that it's always 30 years out. Yes, indeed. Other stuff. Okay, well, they're from the authority who actually works at Los Alamos. Autonomous vehicles, absolutely. Oh, absolutely, autonomous vehicles. We're starting to see that right now, right? I mean, that's happening today.
I expect that was going to be like the internet, like 1994. You didn't see URLs anywhere.
Yes.
December of 1995, you did not see a commercial without it.
Yes, yes. So the comment was the speed with which URLs became popular. It was 1994. There wasn't much of URLs. You couldn't see them. But within a year, or that year, during the duration of that year, we suddenly started seeing URLs everywhere. I think that's a pretty accurate description. Anything else? Virtual reality. What was another? You had another, or augmented. So yeah, virtual or augmented reality. Absolutely something that we see sort of just creeping in maybe 2-3 years ago, and sort of we think we're at the cusp of a revolution in that. Anything else? Mobile phones, yeah. So interestingly enough, I think the expectation is, hey, has that just happened, or are we going to see that happen next? I'll leave that for you guys to decide whether we're going to see another one. But in terms of the speed with which that happened, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. The interesting comment I have about mobile phones, and we'll look at some of these later, is mobile phones are actually starting to change who we are. And for those of us who are parents, we're very aware of this more than maybe our kids are aware, because we see the interaction models change because of these devices we have. And again, we want to ask the question, so what is the human impact, and how do we make sure that it's an impact towards more humanity rather than less? Yes?
Possibly something around YouTube and education.
So education, so I just put in general, I think there's lots of different ways to think about it, but is it, so we haven't named a technology, but is it on the cusp of some type of exponential change, whether it's with YouTube and video, or gaming, or those kinds of technologies? Certainly a space where we sort of think we're going to see an exponential growth, but we still haven't sort of started to see that in any real way. In many cases, our education system is still built on sort of late 1800s type of approach. And I talk to many teachers who can't wait for it to blow up.
There's a lot of structures keeping it in place, though.
Yeah. No, so the comment was there's a lot of structures keeping it in place. And again, a comment I'll make later on as we'll see, is it turns out in many cases there are structures or legal systems that are in place that are actually preventing proceeding at a pace that is slower than the technology itself. And we need to be mindful of this. In some cases, we need the legal system to catch up. And in some cases, the legal system is actually slowing down the speed of innovation. I'm going to throw in a sort of list that I have here. I've gone through several transitions of this talk, and part of that is sort of changing the title as to what are we going to go ahead and talk about. A couple of years ago, this gentleman named Klaus Schwab came up and announced at the World Economic Forum that we're in the midst of, or just starting at, the fourth industrial revolution. And from a naming perspective, I think it's very helpful to say that we're in a world that is that radical, that there's something huge about what is happening in the world we are today. And I think giving us a vocabulary and calling it the fourth industrial revolution, or just Industry 4.0, is very helpful for us to talk about it. But I do want to say with some constraint, I believe that industrial revolutions are decided in hindsight through history, not in present sight. And so I'm a little nervous embracing the term fourth industrial revolution, as I'm not sure that we are able to see that this is the case. And we'll talk about it later, but if we talk about three the three past industrial revolutions, the third one starting in sort of 1970 with computers, it's hard for me to figure out where the transition is from the 1970s and then into the internet in the 1980s, and then to say, okay, now we go into the fourth industrial revolution. There's a bunch of things about time to consider. There's a bunch of things about democratization to think about. So I'm reluctant to use the term to say, yes, for sure, this is the fourth industrial revolution. But I do think the vocabulary is great. I'm going to try to use the term, it's an inflection point. So whether that's actually the case or not is sort of irrelevant to me. But we're definitely experiencing an inflection point in humanity or in technology, whatever sort of bounds you want to go ahead and give. Some of the things that characterize what make it different. First of all, it's the velocity. The speed with which technology is emerging is staggering. And you can look at so many of the things you guys mentioned and start to sort of see that change. We look at the speed with which cell phones became ubiquitous. The penetration of cell phones within the world population is around 5 billion. So we've got a population of 7.53, roughly, 7.54, no, I'm just kidding. Roughly around there. And population of cell phones is around 5 billion. That's a staggering number. That's not smartphones. That's a significantly less, probably around 2 to 3 billion. But still, that's a staggering penetration in a technology that really only emerged in the last 20 years or so. There were versions of cell phones, obviously, before that. But in terms of the popularity, that's sort of what you're looking at. So the speed with which technology is happening is truly radical. The next thing is, if you took the things you guys listed and look at the breadth of change, whereas from bioengineering to data processing and data, I'll call it data engineering or data architecture, to sort of AI and compute power, whether we look at the various things we talked about with compute power, to 3D printing, that's another technology that's sort of emerged in the last 5 years and is truly transformational. There's an incredible breadth to the technology, and what's also interesting is that breadth is starting to amplify, the breadth in each individual area is amplifying its brethren, right? So you'll find that one area where you've seen significant growth is amplifying the other areas next to it, such that everything is growing exponentially in a transformative way. And lastly, it's impacting all of our systems. We look back again at autonomous vehicles, and what's interesting about the autonomous vehicles is there's no doubt, I think very few people doubt that they are better drivers than we are as human beings, right? I think that's I mean, certainly as technologists, we're unlikely to question that. That does not mean they're perfect. Don't misunderstand. I'm not sure they will ever be. But it turns out that humans aren't either. We're fairly fallible, and especially when it comes to driving. And so this is something where we see we're just waiting for systems to be transformed. And in large part, this technology is transforming the breadth of all systems and making us think differently about those systems. So I've talked about a major inflection point. I'm just going to quickly look at areas where technology is scaling exponentially. So first of all, characteristic of this being an inflection point. Technology is scaling exponentially. The speed with which technology changes is mind-blowing. I've got a couple examples. I'll just show some slides later on. But let's look at a couple technologies. For example, light, electrical light or illumination. If you look at just the short time period that we've seen LEDs emerge, and yet you can go say, well, they're 6 times more productive. They last a ton more time than we have already. And that happened, I mean, literally in 5 years. Suddenly we all like, oh, how do I change my light bulbs to be LED based? Obviously, again, talking about illumination, LEDs have been around for a long time. But that the scale, the fact that these technologies are coming out and are growing exponentially is mind-blowing. I've already mentioned this already, convergence of multiple disciplines. The fact is that we've got all of these disciplines changing, and then they're starting to converge and, in fact, affect each other. That's mind-blowing and is part of the reason I say this is an inflection point. All devices are cyberphysical. I was listening to a talk on cyberphysical devices. And the interesting characteristic about it is that they all care about time. So you're not likely to have a cyberphysical device that doesn't care about time. They all care about time. But ultimately, when we start to think about changing in devices, the fact that they are physical or have physical sensing, and the fact that they are then connected and become sort of the cyber concept is what's really interesting. We've spent, in redoing this space right here, we've spent a significant amount, an embarrassingly large amount of time trying to figure out locks for doors. You wouldn't think this was so difficult, but it turns out the market is a little rough in this area. And one of the things that was interesting, we could get locks that were electronic but were not connected. And time was irrelevant to these devices because we only cared about whether you could lock it or disconnect it from remotely. That was important to us, or we could log who was entering or not entering. But any devices that were not connected, we didn't care about time with them at all. It was irrelevant for time. And it turned out we were totally unsatisfied with those types of devices. So all devices become cyber-physical devices. And they're not only in terms of their usage on their own, the sense that, hey, now we can go unlock or lock the device, but also that we can start to gather data from them. That I can now know who's coming in or not coming in, what the frequency of people entering or not entering, all that type of information that you can start to gather with these devices. Whoa. Probably something that's very close to home for us as engineers and software engineers is that data is now the value proposition. And it's no longer your core business. Oh, my core business is that I provide, taxi service. What's way more interesting is I have measure in terms of the volume of people flow through particular areas. And so frequently we're starting to see a transition where it's not the actual thing that you provide, but the data that can be derived from the thing that you provide. And the data becomes the value proposition rather than the actual item that you're selling. And we notice this when we start to install apps. We sort of say, oh, this would be great to do this. And somebody didn't write that app, not necessarily write the app because they were bored and just decided to go provide it. In many cases, they did it because there's data that they can gather from the application. And that's the value proposition to doing that. Golly, what is that? And because of it, business is changing in fundamental ways. Again, we're all very familiar with this, but the fact that business is changing to no longer be about the product, but about the data is one of the fundamental ways that business is changing itself. And if I look at the impact on you guys in your areas, I would challenge you and say, hey, what do you need to do in your business or your company to say, how do we make this transition so that it's no longer just about the thing that we're manufacturing, but about the data that can be derived from that? And if you're not thinking about that problem, you're making a buggy whip rather than being in the transportation business. And so I think it behooves us as the employees of organizations to be challenging our leadership to start moving into a world that is about the data and what can be gathered from the data, not just about the product that you're producing. Supply chain. So there's this connection between the supply chain and the buyer. And the thing that's interesting, we talked about autonomy in cars, but there's also autonomy in terms of the supply chain. Supply chain and the buyer are now autonomous in terms of their interactions. I don't actually have to go to the store to buy something. I can make a decision sitting at my desk to buy something and it just shows up. And it's completely, I don't need to experience advertising. I don't need to go through some kind of I guess advertising campaign where, I saw the 5 items here and I decided this. It totally turns out if I decided I need something, and the vast majority of times the initial decision on what to get came from myself, and then I went out and just bought it and it showed up in my home. And now we're seeing today, like in the last 2 months, transitions from, okay, it was delivered in 2 days to now it's delivered in 1 day. And we're that impatient to start seeing that delivery happen. And it's that fast, right? I mean, 2 years ago, 2-day delivery, that was cool. We're going to pay $95 for that. Now we see that happen, and it's 1-day delivery, and we're that impatient for that. Couple comments here.
It's almost more of a question because I challenge the concept that you did it, you thought of it on your own. It's like the idea is, like, I don't need a drone right now, but at some point I'm going to see somebody with a drone and go, I want to do that. first saw drum races.
Yeah.
Third person, it's like, okay, I want that, and somebody's going to learn how to monetize that if they haven't already.
Yeah. So it's a fair comment. I would be naive to say that advertising doesn't matter. I think that was a misspeak on my part. I think that there is still an influence of advertising, and obviously we look at the impact of social media on decisions that we're making around voting and that kind of stuff. There's huge influence, and it is pretty significant. I guess what I'm saying is in the past, we went to the store to find out if they had something, and then we made some choices from that. We don't really do buying that way anymore. And in fact, it's more inconvenient to go to the store and look at their selection than it is for us to sit at our desk and do some research and buy the item without even leaving, without ever putting pants on, as I like to say. This revolution or this inflection point is impacting all industries. And a little bit later, we'll start to say, well, how is it impacting and what is going to happen for industries that seem well established? And we'll take a look at those. The fusion of technology, I've already mentioned that they're amplifying each other. We've talked about this already. The other thing that I want to mention, and I did in the case with the iPhone, is we talk about being changed as individuals, but that goes all the way to a worldwide scale. The technology that we're talking about is affecting us in at a personal level, but then in all groups up to the entire globe. And so it's with this large set of stuff that I say, man, we are experiencing an inflection point, something that we never experienced in a past industrial revolution. Whether that's a new one or no is somewhat irrelevant to me, but it is certainly something that we should be extremely mindful of. And if anything, the challenge that I want to leave with you is to sort of open your eyes and recognize that this is going on, and you need to jump out of the pot. You can't just stay letting it boil around you. You need to be very mindful of it and figure out how you have influence on that, presumably in the positive sense.
Did you say jump out of the pot?
Yes, before you jump, you need to jump out of the pot. You need. What I'm trying to say is be aware that this is happening and don't just stay getting boiled around you. Yeah, thank you. So a frog in a pot, that's the analogy. Don't get boiled. I'm not saying you need to go live in a forest. I mean, you're welcome to do that, but that's not what I'm trying to say. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Lots of all, but nothing concrete.
The comment was lots of all of those things, but nothing concrete. Yes?
Do you think it'd be beneficial to slow this progress?
Ooh. The question was, do I think it would be beneficial to slow the progress? What do you guys think?
Is that even, it seems kind of moot. I don't think it's slowing down. I think it's going to accelerate.
I think some of these things like 5G, nobody really knows what's going to happen. Same thing with holding this thing up to before we had the Bluetooth. It's now hold up to our ears. You have that so close to your brain for so long. We don't know what's going to happen. And we don't know where this is going to lead us in 20 years. So
But if you slow it down, it's not going to stop. I mean, when they put the stem cell ban on in the U.S., we ended up coming up with a way of doing stem cell research on skin cells, I think. So it might slow things down.
So first of all, I think the question is worth asking. There's no doubt in my mind that the question is worth asking. And the question being, just for the recording, the question being, should we slow down? I think the response, and I think that it's an important point to make, is the question is it possible? As individuals, I can choose to not have a cell phone. That's a totally valid choice, but that doesn't change the fact that cell phones are going to change the world, or have changed the world, or are changing the world. As a nation, we can choose not to participate in stem cell research or those kinds of things. But you can be sure there are other nations, rogue or not, that are going to totally embrace that and look at ways to do it. I appreciate the question because I think that comes back to the humanity portion of this. That says, okay, well, what do we need to do? I also want to say that there is just because this technology is happening, the fact that the technology is awesome, meaning it is incredible, it's amazing, does not mean it is good. And so that's with great power becomes great responsibility. And what concerns me is that we decide to not participate, and that means we get left behind and we don't have influence of where the technology is going for the good. And these are really hard questions, right? I mean, this is philosophy 101 at the end of the day, or ethics 101.
We can individually decide how fast we go, right? I mean, we shouldn't feel compelled because everybody's doing it that we have to do it.
Yeah.
You know, make rational choices,
Yeah.
think about what you're doing.
Yeah.
That's every aspect of life.
Yeah. So the comment was, we as individuals we can go whatever pace we like, and we should consider carefully what pace we want to go at. More important, we should be reflective about this. To me, cell phones are a fantastic example of this, especially as parents. At what point do we allow our kids to embrace cell phones, and what kind of controls do we have on that, and things like that? Because they are amazing devices. And when my 10-year-old, 5-year-old, whatever the age is, comes and says, I'd like a cell phone, I want a computer, at what point do I say yes or no, and what are the constraints I put in that? Well, those same questions we're asking as parents, we should be asking of ourselves about X, Y, and Z in real ways. Comment.
Just a question, is anybody cataloging and exploring the different paradigms that are existing right now? It's like, usually paradigms are something that change once a generation, but I think somewhere in the 90s that got shattered, and now there's like, I have no idea, I haven't even thought about
Yeah, I'm not sure. So the question was, is anyone cataloging the paradigm shifts? I'm not sure that there's a catalog per se. I certainly think that we are mindful of the disciplines, and as we look at each of the disciplines that are in education or being part of science, I think we've started to identify the things that are moving at exponential levels. And as entrepreneurs, which I sort of would say from my perspective, I look at it from an entrepreneur's perspective, I need to look at those sciences as a way of entrepreneurship and say, how do I include or get on those exponential waves and see what's happening. In many cases, it's not like, I figured out, I invented the high-powered LED such that I can have light done in a different way. But how can I take advantage of it in a human way? And I think that for us, that's part of our job as technologists is to keep track of that and figure out how to take advantage of those in healthy ways. One of the things that's characteristic about industrial revolutions from a historical perspective is that they always affected labor. And the identification of an industrial revolution was really how did it affect labor. And so I want to step away a little bit instead of say, okay, as we consider this as a possible industrial revolution, again, it's not really important to me to say which it is. I can say that labor is being affected or will be drastically affected within the next short time. Again, 10 years, 5 years, I don't know what that number is. And so there's a number of things that we should start to think about. First of all, companies are not experiencing diminishing returns in order to scale. And part of that is because they've digitized themselves. And by becoming digital, it turns out digital tends towards zero. And the best example I have this is photography. If we look at the scale, and I got some graphs that show how photography has grown, it is to the point now that it makes the only reason we consider taking or not taking a photograph is because we're not sure how to manage the volumes of photos that we have. And we have more of a problem of sort of finding photos or organizing photos than we do taking photos. Whereas you look at the previous life where we sort of had to go into a dark room and expose it and make sure that nobody walked in, and it was very much contained by time and money to develop. The cost of photographs is zero. And not tending toward, it's zero. It truly is zero. And I think as we look at a digital world, digitization is tending towards zero such that economies are becoming majorly changed. So scaling is no longer expensive. We're all familiar, we all know this is going on, but the whole idea is that we're gigafying labor. The whole idea that for me as an employer, when I go ahead and hire someone, I'm taking on a significant number of obligations that I'm not required to worry about if I go and hire a contractor. And so it's a really interesting world that we're going into with Uber around and Airbnb around the fact that they are all contract. They're all contract based. It's a gigafied labor movement. Interesting thing happening. There's work happening right now in Washington State to go ahead and eliminate 1099 employment. So that's the contract employment, and there's movements to do that. I'm not arguing whether that's good or bad. It's interesting that that's happening. It's interesting that it's happening in Washington. But as we think again about innovation, the gigafy labor is a big deal, and it's really what allows people like Uber to scale at the volume that they've scaled. The fact that they are a transportation service without any transportation employees is an obvious statement about the way they do their work. The other thing that we'll leave it there. Yes.
How would that affect someone like yourself, where you're contracting out consultants for 1099 because you're paying them too?
Yeah. So 1099 is a little different for a company versus an individual. So the vast majority of 1099 work for individuals to be contractors for a company for the period of a year is no longer legal in Washington State. We started out when we were running Intelitech. We did start out with actually everybody was a contractor, and then there was a law change. This is about 10 years ago now, 8 years ago, that said you could not have a 1099 contractor or that was exclusively working for you. You had to have many forms of income coming in from many different other companies. In the case of a service company, we obviously have many customers that we're working with, so that's really not an issue from that perspective. But even if we were offering people who are hiring us, we have to make sure we have employees working for us, but then we've got many different employees, and so that's not a problem. I'm not saying this is going to pass. I'm not going to give any forecast on that. I think it's interesting that challenge is happening, and we certainly see sort of reports about this, especially in California as well, to say, look, can Uber continue being Uber without having to pay, for example, payroll taxes, right? What's the payroll taxes that have to be paid? And if you read sort of employment law and stuff like that, when you sign your contract with whoever's hiring you as a 1099, they say you're obligated to pay all these taxes. And it turns out if you don't, they can actually go back to the other company to get the money if it's not done correctly. So the other thing that's interesting about this is that offshore is, I don't think this is new. We went through this for the last 20 years. But offshore is very easy to do because of the fact that there's no employment obligation with offshore resources. It turns out I can hire an offshore resource way more easily than I can hire an onshore resource, and I can hire an offshore resource way more easily than I can hire an employee. So it's sort of like offshore is trivial, then I can go contractor, and that's a little bit more complicated, and then I go employee, and especially in my case, man, you guys are a nightmare. No, I'm just kidding. And then I can go to employees, and it gets even more complicated after that. And so we have a world right now where from an organizational standpoint, offshore is by far the easiest to hire. There's the legal obligations are way lower. Essentially, I just send a paycheck, and I'm just going to, the most I'm going to do is if there's some kind of import tax, and there's not on services, but there's on products, then I might have to worry about that. We've talked about this already. This one's really interesting. Net income per employee. So you don't have to say it out, but have any of you thought about what is the income for you that you as an employee for your company that's contributing to it? And I looked up some numbers about this. Detroit in the 1990s with the three biggest car manufacturers, they had a revenue of around $250 billion. And if you look at the per employee cost with 1.2 million employees in the 3 biggest car industries, you're looking at about $30,000 per employee of earnings. Now that earnings going towards stockholders, and you've got to remember there's tons of other expenses that come into play, especially if there's assets that are owned that are allowing those companies to earn. So if you've put a whole bunch of investment in assets and such that those assets are now got an ROI, they're returning income, then the fact that those employees are earning as much as $30,000, it's not just because of what they're doing right now, it's because there's a whole bunch of other assets in the company. And so this picture isn't a true financial model of what companies are like. But it is interesting from the perspective, $30,000, the biggest manufacturers in industry, and you're looking at that kind of number. And then you start looking at the 3 biggest, or some of the 3 biggest tech companies based in Silicon Valley. They were all within 15 miles of each other or so, Google, Facebook. And they're looking at a sort of average of $690,000 per employee. I mean, we're not talking revenue, we're talking profit. Right? That is a staggering number. It is absolutely staggering to start seeing the kind of earnings that are coming from those companies. And we start to see a huge transition. And when we talk about labor and a transition in labor, the key thing to notice is that means I need less people for me to be hugely profitable. And we start to wonder, okay, at what point is the job market going to be drastically affected? Now, we're at one of the lowest job market percentages right now that we've had in the last 30 years. So when does this start to happen? But from a factual standpoint, the fact that so much can be garnered by an employee on this amount is staggering. Comment.
Is that 155,000
employees? Yes, it is not counting contractors and offshore. That's correct. Here's some more details on that, just to break it down. I've actually got 4 companies just to have a sort of listing of sort of how that works out. So Facebook is up there with $600,000 per employee. Sorry, that number. I'm going to say don't pay attention to this number because I don't think that's correct. The Facebook number is 600 and something thousand. So,
not 1.8 billion.
Right. It's definitely not 1.8 million. So I need to correct that number. I apologize. However, I will say I will say it here. Here's some better look at the numbers. Any ideas, just out of interest, which company has the highest income per employee? These are public companies, obviously. What is it? I don't know this company. So here's some numbers. I talked about, Apple's about 393, Alphabet is about 170, or Google's around 170. Facebook here is around 599. This is a little bit older than the stats that I had. So the ones that I had on the other slide are actually newer. These are about a year or 2 old. But we're not. So now that gives us sort of a good. So we're within one screen, right? That's pretty good. But there's a couple outliers here. So I've just got another screen. And there's Freddie Mac. That's at 1.3 million per employee. And at the bottom we got Fannie Mae at 1.7 million. And you're all shaking your heads.
It explains 2007 better.
Yeah, something. I'd say that you could probably argue that. Yeah, it explains 2007 better. I'm not going to get into. I'm sort of throwing this out of interest, which is why I was able to identify the numbers earlier that I miscoded them. I apologize about that. The point at the end of the day is that the need to go for a growth income is not dependent on volume and how many employees you have. And that, again, digitization is allowing us to gain profit and sort of tends towards zero in terms of expense. And that's a staggering thing to be aware of. And one last thing, can you see that one? Let me see if I can zoom in. one last thing to be aware of, again, focusing on labor, is the fact that the top 1% continues to grow, but salaries or incomes for those below there, for the common person, as per se, has started to stagnate. And that is also very interesting and revealing. And what impact does that have on you and the people around us? What was that? Guillotines. Okay, yes, okay. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. This is very curious to me for a couple reasons. Let me get out of that. I'm going to quickly. So there is something about the fact that our life has improved because of all these transitions that we've talked about in the labor market. We look at the fact, and I just labeled accommodation, but this is the Airbnb example. My ability to travel to weird places. I mentioned before we talked, I was in Haiti, and I was not staying in a major town, and I don't speak French, and I even speak less Creole. The fact that I could get into Haiti, there's no Uber, get into Haiti, find a place to stay without speaking a word of French, stay overnight, I rode a scooter, three-person, it was just a regular scooter, but I was three of us riding the scooter, and sort of start to experience it. I could never have done that in the same way that I was able to literally show up at immigration, get through, and go find a place to stay in the middle of nowhere. There's no hotels, those aren't options, and experience a culture that is pretty radically different from the US. That's all through the fact that I can do things like accommodation. And on the other side, from the supplier perspective, I'm working with a person, or I'm staying in a house of a person who has no way to get that kind of income otherwise. And so that's a really interesting model. What's more interesting is that when I left, my guide, I'm not sure what you call him, but he mentioned the fact of how challenging. We sort of shared how challenging life was, and now you can start. He doesn't have the ability to buy houses or buy accommodation, but things like Airbnb are not just offering accommodation; they're also offering experiences. So he could sort of digitize his ability to be a guide and start to advertise to people around the world and say, hey, if you want to come to Haiti, which turns out is really hard to visit. I probably did more research than Haiti than many other places I've visited in the world. But if there's some way that we could connect the guide with the weird guy who wants to go to Haiti, then that connection allows him to have an income that otherwise is totally unreachable. And so it's an interesting world where we can start to sort of gigafy economy, but we're starting to get people the ability to work in ways that is just not possible. In that particular case, it turns out there's a little bit of a problem because the Airbnb that I stayed at, he opened his home or his bedroom in May, and I was the first visitor. And in the entire time I was there, I was the only white guy. I didn't see any other white guys there. And I'm not making any statement about that, but to say there's not enough of a market of weird guys wanting to go into Haiti. And I wasn't going to Port-au-Prince. I was going to like northern parts of Haiti. There's just not enough of a market of people doing that. So there's still a bunch of work that needs to be done. But the interesting transition, if you look at the World Economic Forum and the focus that they're doing, their emphasis now in Africa and start getting kids to code is better than anything I'm seeing in the US. They're starting at a younger age, and they're spending a longer time in middle school, grade school, learning to code than we are in the US. At what point do we say transition coming from China and India to start moving to Africa, because they are focusing on an education that says we know coding is the future, and we need to be there. And the mindset or the mind change in modern day Africa, and when I say that, I'm like talking the last 5 years, is radical. It's radical, and it's ahead of what's going on in some of the first world countries that you guys are most familiar with. Buying a product. We've talked about this a little bit, but buying product right now is totally different. I would hazard a guess that all of us in the room buy more stuff and spend more money online than we do in a store. If I had to take a sort of poll, when was the last time you went to the store? And yes, you're the person that has to go do the grocery shopping. Still not quite there in terms of doing that. You may not have gone for months. I mean, it probably measured in months rather than days. It's the last time you went to the store. Now, I do say this knowing that I am not normal, so I shop a lot less than most people, and I certainly go to stores a lot less than most. So maybe you're different, but I suspect we're tending towards measuring in months rather than measuring in days when it comes to stuff other than groceries, everyday kinds of items. And that's interesting. Transportation, we've talked about Uber already. That's starting to get changed. The fact is, it's not only the Ubers, but the autonomous driving that's going to sort of radically change transformation. It's not just for humans, but it's also for goods, right? Tesla's coming out with a heavy-duty trucking or autonomous trucking, probably this year, if they haven't already. Watching a movie, again, simple examples. This is different. We all do this differently. Now we are all caught in the rut of spending too much time trying to decide what to watch. We probably spend more time in that decision than we are watching because we have such a vast quantity of things to choose from. And then playing a game. The way we can start playing games and stuff like that is different in many ways. And I would suggest all of those are sort of quality of life improvements. How is this working here? Sorry? I am going to escape out of there. Okay, so demise. This is a bad. Sorry. Here we go. This is. What is that? Yeah. We talked about exponential growth. So I want to just go through a couple examples. I mentioned already LED going from incandescent to LEDs, a radical shift. Digital photography, again, is another one. So photos taken. Here's the graph I mentioned I was going to take earlier. So you look at it. So we're tending around 0, 1970. In the last 10 years, we're no longer counting. We're now counting with E. Right? My graph, we talk about exponential growth. It's unfathomable what that change is. It's unfathomable. Those kinds of numbers is something you can't imagine. By the way, the largest quantity of photo libraries, right? We can't even measure. The Library of Congress, you guys probably can't see that. But you look at this comparison between the Library of Congress and Facebook, and you just realize that it's unfathomable. We have no concept of the size of these numbers. Go look at drones. The fact we got hefty drones, so 1 to 2 kilograms for a heavy lifting drone is sort of today's technology. We've got drones coming out today. You can buy drones that to start 10 towards 8. Many of you have probably seen videos where they're starting to carry humans. Human-powered drones, they're not yet ready for commercial, but you get the idea that, if I need to get medicine into a war zone, totally no big deal. Like, that's no big deal today. And that's totally changing. And then ultimately, of course, right, drones are starting to become warfare themselves. The fact is, I can now have battles and destroy human life without ever even being on site. Starts to change the way we think. Yes.
10 years ago, the Air Force was realizing that their drone pilots in Omaha, Nebraska, had more logged combat time than most of their combat pilots.
The comment was drone pilots, which is an interesting word. I'm not sure that works. Their drone pilots spend more time in the office being drone pilots than their combat pilots do out in the field.
In combat.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. In combat, right?
That was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and that's 10 years ago. Thank you. 3D printing. So an interesting thing that it just happens to be a side project that I'm involved in. Working with a company out of Vancouver, they have figured out how to do 3D metal printing. So there's 3 companies in the world, this is the third one, that can go print metal by 3D. It turns out the way you do this, there's 3 steps. There's the printing step, where you actually go ahead and get the item printed, per se. Then there's a debinding step that removes the plastic. to sort of that gave it its shape for the metal that you're printing. And then last, then there's the sintering step where you sort of harden the metal and get it to be hard. And the company that I'm working with now, literally they started in an earnest effort at the beginning of last year. They started building a 3D metal printer in earnest effort. Like there was a little bit of dabbling before that, and the ideas were sort of formed around. And they figured out they could skip the entire debinding process by using water. And so they have now taken the 3-stage 3D metal printing and they've eliminated an entire step such that you can now go buy a commercial 3D printer for around $150K that can go print 3D metal that is currently around 80% strength but tending towards 90 or more. And that's, you can go buy these printers on the market. Right. So we talk about 3D printing. It's a difference between sort of an additive versus subtractive process. So what we have today for doing manufacturing with metal is mostly a subtractive process. We start with a hunk of metal and we subtract stuff out. Where the difference with 3D metal printing, both in plastic, or 3D printing, both in plastic or non, is the fact that it's now an additive process, that we can go ahead and construct that. At what point do you start to see this type of thing, say, hey, well, now let's just print the car? I mean, how far do you go? And it turns out this specific printer is not just printing, metal. It can go ahead and print porcelain, and it can print metals of different kinds, and it can switch between those metals. And so that totally transforms. And what's interesting is you go further. That's a picture of the debinding. What's interesting further is that we can now construct stuff that wasn't possible to create before. You couldn't build I can't say solid. You couldn't build this without taking two pieces together and joining them together. But with a 3D printer, I can actually make stuff that was not possible to make before without having some kind of join. In a 3D printer, I can go build that. Yes?
So it kind of goes back to your comment on data earlier on. Pretty soon here, the value of what's printed is not going to be the value that we see today. It's going to be the data and the schematics.
Yeah. Yes. So let me take it a little differently. It turns out that the people that sort of show up to see these printers, in many cases, the samples that they come and want to say, okay, can you print this? It would be cheaper and stronger if they did it, a traditional manufacturing with a subtractive process. It would be cheaper and faster. But it turns out they don't know how to use a lathe, and they don't know how to, build these materials. They come from a mindset that says, print. And even though it's slower, and even though it's not as strong, that is a more attractive model for them than to go learn how to go ahead and do metal manufacturing. And that's what's really interesting, is because now what's we're discovering that's driving the market for the 3D metal printing is that, I don't know what the right word is. Is it lazy? I don't know, right? It's that this innovation mindset that says, I don't need to know all the details. I just want to push print.
And it's on demand.
Yeah, absolutely.
On demand and minimal investment. I've invested in learning.
Yeah.
It seems like an extension of the gig economy. If I can't hire somebody right now, I can have somebody.
Yeah,
do it.
right.
And that supplies. I don't have to schedule.
Yeah. So the comment is an extension of the gig economy, but what's more interesting about that, it's also tending towards not needing the employee. Right? So what's interesting about this is I no longer need the manufacturing shop that does this. I can focus on just the knowledge workers to go produce the goods. And that's a transformative kind of concept. And we're not talking about simple stuff, right? This is metal mechanics. So. Yes, absolutely. They actually did. We help with the. So sorry. The comment was, have you heard about continuous composites out of Coeur d'Alene? And they did a TED talk actually in TEDx Coeur d'Alene just earlier this year. Was it this year? End of last year. And they're right here in town, and they're doing continuous deposits. It's a slightly different technology, the way that they're working, and they're not doing metal, but they're doing fiber and stuff like that. So yeah. Yep. Yes. They've got really cool videos. If you guys want to look at continuous deposits, it's a very, very cool what they're doing. This company here is called Rapidia. As I say, they're just going to market right now. They sold 3 printers. And we're expecting sort of full gear, full road ahead next year. And they're totally transforming the way 3D metal printing is being done at all. So, and I think what's staggering to me is the cost, right? That you can sort of get a printer, a 3D metal printer, around the $150,000 kind of number. That's fairly staggering to me when it looks at what does it take for me to have a metallurgist or something like that to go do the manufacturing itself. That's a staggering number. Internet usage, just some quick ideas out here. I'm going to go quickly. We're going to run out of time here. So we're looking next year about hitting 5 billion devices connected. 5 billion devices. And the growth of that to 1 trillion is around 5 to 10 years. So we'll see that double. Again, we're looking at exponential growth.
It says 50 billion.
What did I say?
5.
I meant 50. I'm sorry.
It's all about exponents.
It's all about numbers, right? It's just, I thank you. It's 50 billion devices next year. We're going to see that double to 1 trillion. I see double, that's double to 1 trillion. No, that's not doubling. We're going to see that exponentially grow to 1 trillion in 2025, around 2030. Again, exponential growth. So we look at all these areas, photography, lighting, 3D printing, this exponential growth. We're going to see that get to sort of the 230 number. I do want to call into question that number when I say 1 trillion. It did come out from Cisco. I'm not sure how much that can be trusted, but it was a study done by HP, so that makes it a little better. Anyway, so just to make you aware, it's unfathomable. Like these numbers, we have no concept of these numbers. In all cases that we're talking about this, we just can't.
We don't have 1 trillion anything else.
Debt. I'm sorry, was that my out loud voice? I can't believe I said that. Yeah. So they're sort of Internet of Things connected. Again, the area we need to be worried here or be concerned about or we're going to be capitalizing on, I'm not sure what I should say, is the fact that these are sensors, right? So in this room, ignoring all the computers, we have something like 20 or 30 sensors in the room right now. Right? Now, we don't have video. You don't need to worry about that. But we have these kinds of sensors that we've got motion sensors and all types of stuff, that we bought for like $35. I mean, like low-cost kinds of sensors. They're connected to the internet. They flag my phone when you break down the door or whatever the deal is. And the cost of these items is tending towards zero. And we see that change within a period of months, if not years. I mean, it's a period of definitely years, but almost months in that price perspective. Yes?
So is there more of a future trend towards employment of being an integrator as opposed to a creator?
So the question was, is there more of a career as an integrator rather than a supplier? And I don't know. Right? I'm not sure I can answer that question. And this is the key thing that I would look at. Let's focus on we're all software engineers, so let's focus on the software industry. At what point do I go by line of business system A and line of business system B and line of business system C, and they talk to each other already, such that the software engineer isn't required? Now, I'm not trying to be, a doomsday prediction or anything like that, but there is a question as we start to try to do innovation, we start to think about the ideation process. At what point is it becoming really difficult to overtake the incumbent? Is Lyft going to succeed with Uber? Right? Are we going to go come up with a new idea that is not going to be capitalized? What prevents Amazon from doing the idea that you're selling on Amazon, just manufacturing them themselves? And they're looking at the stats of the items that are being sold, and aside from IP, that may or may not prevent it, I can't make a prediction on that, they have all the data that you don't have about what items are worth manufacturing or not worth manufacturing. And they have it better than you are, even though you're the one doing the manufacturing. Because all the data, they're the distributor. They have the power right there because they have the data. And that's why the data is more valuable than the item that you're selling. And it's even more valuable to you. When I decide I want to go start a business, I want to open a dental office, I want to start a coffee shop, for me, that's a significant amount of research I need to decide which corner am I going to put that block. Every single person who has access to the data at Google knows almost instantaneously where's the best place to do that. So for them to scale their economy in terms of deciding what other things to invest in is a totally different formula than it is for you. The very inhibitors are the things that they have at their fingerprints. That should be disconcerting. Now, I'm in no way saying that we can't overtake the incumbents. I think that's absolutely possible. I look at what Rapidia is doing with the 3D metal printing, or there's a number of areas where we see this happening, but it is non-trivial. Non-trivial. Internet usage. I don't know if you can see this. Gives you some idea of internet usage around the world and penetration. If you look at Africa, you're still sort of looking at 39% there. But still, that's a staggering number. Although, interestingly, I will mention that in the Africa case, when it comes to 39, we can assume that that's not with computers. Right? You can absolutely assume that that's not with computers. That is with phones, hopefully smartphones, or the penetration there is not nearly as good. But there's some kind of internet access that's starting to drop. One of the things that's interesting as well is you start to think, I've always been impressed because, Africa skipped the landline telephone market. Like, it totally skipped. But it turns out Africa doesn't have internet everywhere. And when they decide to go invest in internet, if it's not wireless, it's fiber. They skip wires altogether. Skip wires. And it goes directly to fiber, because if you're going to go install something today, you might as well go directly to fiber. And so our ability to get the last mile done is really hard in the United States. But in Africa, they don't have the first mile, and they don't have the last mile. And whatever they're going to go invest, it's going to be in fiber. And so they get the ability to sort of move at a different pace than we have necessarily here. Robotics. This just came out. This was announced this weekend, I think, roughly. I asked the question, because of the political climate that we're in, I asked the question, are you more worried about your job being replaced by the immigrant or the robot? And what's interesting about that question is, let's imagine that we are the agricultural worker, which is presumably the challenge that we're having with the market coming out of Mexico. And by the way, I'm not making any political statements here at all. But as we look at the worry and the concern that's coming out of that market, which are you more concerned about taking away the agricultural worker's job? Is it the immigrant or it's the robot? And this is out today. And we're not talking about apples, which are hard. There's interesting technologies for going and picking the apple. We're talking about raspberries and blueberries. If you have gone out and done raspberry picking or blueberry picking, it is hard not to come back with blue fingers. Like, that's a difficult challenge. This is impressive robotics. And I go back. What are you more concerned about when it comes to your job? Now, I'm assuming, and in fact, it turns out, that as programmers, we've still got a long career. But the estimates right now on a world scale, again, looking at first world countries, so Western world, let's say, it's around 50% of jobs are under challenged by computerization. Right now, 5% of work can be done by your job. 5% of jobs can be replaced entirely by computerization, and 60% of workers have 30% of the job that can be done by a computer rather than them. And that's true today. So I'm going to say those numbers again. 5% of jobs can be replaced entirely by computers. Let's think of some, so there's one restriction on that. The law may not have caught up. So let's think of some examples. Pharmaceutical, being a pharmacist, right? What prevents a vending machine from being the pharmacy? The law, right? So the comment was liability, and the end of the day, it's the law, right? The law is preventing that. But in terms of know-how and knowledge, it is all in the computer, and the pharmacist is using it. right? Yes, the pharmacists had to do tons of school, and I'm not an expert in pharmacy. Yes, they had to go to tons of school, but at the end of the day, what drives their ability to do their job well is what the computer tells me they can or can't have, because they know not only about this medication that I'm giving you to, but the other 10 that I've sold you over the last year. And so I know all the interactions about what's going on. Data, again, I can use that data to figure out what kind of diseases you have. So the pharmacist, by selling you the drug, they're also able to identify what kinds of medical conditions are going on in your life. And their power is in the data, not in the fact that they're selling you the drugs. Yes?
Somebody figured out that they could tell when a woman was pregnant
Yes.
before.
Yes.
she
Before a parents knew? Yes.
No, before she knew because of her searches.
Yes. Yes. So the comment was, hey, there's been cases where people, the stores or the business was able to figure out and know more about you than you were able to know about your searches. Several examples I know about that. Pancreatic cancer, it turns out that people searched on symptoms, and they discovered that Google could figure out whether you had pancreatic cancer before you did. There have been cases where flyers were sent to households trying to sell you baby items because the store knew that your daughter was pregnant rather than you were. So there's a bunch of scenarios like this where data is fairly dangerous. And it has some consequences to it. So that's robots. This robot here, Baxter, I'm not sure if you heard about this robot, Baxter. So it is not prescriptively programmed and told what to do. You demonstrate how to do the work. It uses computer vision and analysis to figure out what that is, and then it can start doing that job. Currently on the market, I could be slightly off here, around $22K, right, $22,000 for this type of robot to go ahead and do work on them. And we got to look at the labor, the effect of labor. This is radical.
You don't need people like us.
We don't need to be like me anyway, but.
So what's the maintenance on it?
I don't know.
I'm just thinking about how many people, like getting a person for $22K, let alone buying one for 10 years.
Yeah. I think the focus should not be on this specific example, which I am by no means an expert. The focus should be on, we're talking about exponential changes in technology, and if this is here, even in prototype form, you should be nervous. Right? That's a staggering change. DNA sequencing, I'm not the expert on DNA sequencing, but if you look at the cost factor only from the $2.7 billion it took us to sequence the initial genome down to today, where you can go and buy it for $100. It's not the same. It's not a full log, whatever. But that move of digitization down to zero is staggering. And I've picked 5 examples. We could do this talk the entire day with the same theme repeating. Exponential growth happen in a way that we can't control. It's going to happen anyway, and what do we do about that? Talked a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. I've talked about the fact that this is often termed Industry 4.0. That's a term that came out of Germany a few years ago. The World Economic Forum is talking about this. This is the 4th Industrial Revolution. I don't really care what the term is. Yeah, I've already covered this. Where's my... This does not work very well. Yeah. Have I talked about this? I don't think I did. So if you start to look at industries that are affected, we've already seen the fact that newspapers are starting to disappear fast. This is true in even local newspapers. This is especially disconcerting to me because I look at newspapers as being a source of truth. That doesn't mean it's completely true. I'm not saying it's 100% accurate. But I feel like the newspapers are driving towards people who are searching out truth. And that could be truth in what's really going on in Beijing and China. And I don't see that being suddenly us figuring out what's happening because of social media. I think there needs to actually be reporters that are investigating it. In Myanmar, they've just started to turn off cell phones in what's happening there for the folks escaping there. And they started turning their cell phones off. I don't see how I would know that without there being some kind of reporter that's actually investigating and researching. In the United States, there's tons of things that go on that we look to reporters to sort of say, yes, is that really the case or not the case? And I don't care whether it's how Epstein died or whatever. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter what the truth is. That's not my point. My point is that there's somebody that's actually concerned with that truth. And as we start to see the demise of these technologies, we really wonder at what point will that start to be made up? Will CNN say, will CNN be the source of news? And we say, yeah, we can trust that they're doing that as much. I don't have a judgment on that. It's a thing of concern. Music radically changed. Television. If I took a sample of you and said, how many of you still have television? I know for a fact that the people that I work with on a regular basis, forget that. We've got Hulu, or because it's way easier, it's on demand, I get what I want, when I want it. Again, we're talking a transition of 5 years. Like 5 years. Taxis is interesting. Of course, the one example to look at is Uber, but more importantly is what happens with autonomous vehicles. What happens when you really can park your Tesla in the parking lot here at Intellitract and put it into taxi mode and go start working while it goes off and earns revenue for you. We're talking that a year away. It's cool. Yes, sure. Not if you're a taxi driver. I was talking with a taxi driver out in New York. He got a mortgage for his taxi license for around $150,000. Whether that was this was his investment for the rest of his career. It is totally being undermined by Uber to the point that I can go get a taxi because the airport has a law that says Uber can't show up. I can take the taxi to the closest spot, which is $15. So I just did this. I was in Puerto Rico. I didn't know where I needed to go. I wasn't sure what the details were, and the places I needed to go was out of the taxi's ability to estimate the cost. Right? So I'm at the airport. It's out of the range. So the attendant who was saying you got to get in the taxi, she just said, "Oh, that's too far. Go here and catch an Uber." So I paid my requisite $15 to go here, which was a restaurant that was just outside the airport. And then I got my Uber, and it was $8. Right? So it was more expensive for me to go the 2 miles from the airport to the restaurant than it was for me to go the 12 miles from the restaurant to the place I was working.
There is a question whether Uber and Lyft are sustainable when the current cost structure.
There's also... So the comment was, hey, it's questionable whether the Uber and Lyft are sustainable in the cost structure. Totally agree. And that's a valid question. It's even a valid question for the Uber driver. Right? It's not actually clear that this is even worthwhile for them, although we continue to see increases, and so it's an interesting
Beyond basic income, is anybody doing, are there any models on the table that handle a vast horde of human beings?
So the question is, beyond basic income, which is we all get an income regardless of whether we have worked or not, just to sort of give some definition around it, is there any work being done in terms of what to do with a workforce that no longer has jobs? I want to make 2 comments about this. The first comment is, when mechanization happened, and I'm looking at specifically the second industrial revolution, the idea was, with electricity and production lines and manufacturing, the radical change that's happening there, it's going to destroy the labor market. There's not going to be jobs anymore. And it turned out that didn't happen. Right? So that we've got history that says it was forecast that it would and it didn't. Okay? And I'm stating that as a fact. Now the question to ask is, what's different about today? Right? And so when you go to the question that you're asking, it was, hey, with maybe 50% of the jobs disappearing within our lifetime, I don't know what the number is you want to give me, are we just going to experience, another, hey, we just got smarter and we were able to do more programming, or we were able to work with knowledge, more of us could work in knowledge-based careers or something like that. I'm not forecasting this, right? So I'm not making a prediction or anything like that. But one of the things that's interesting is if we start to see a growth economy of the scale that we do see because of digitization, such that the amount of labor that was done historically is not needed to be done in the future, the question that we should begin to ask is, do we need to have jobs to the same extent as we did before? Do we need to work the same amount? Could we start working less? Does humankind's, are we able to improve humanity by limiting how much we have to work, because a lot of these things are tended towards zero cost, so that providing for the needs of those who aren't working is not that difficult. Now again, it's a tightrope I'm walking here, right, between entering a political discussion versus entering a factual discussion about what's happening. So this is very much a question ask, right? But the question that's worthwhile asking is to say, is it unreasonable to say that because of the exponential growth in so many careers, that we can start to look and say, yes, we can support a basic income for everybody, even if they're not working. And we can still have people who are super successful. And then you start to ask interesting questions like, oh, well, what do I do to motivate a high school kid who knows they're going to get basic income and they're going to stop working? They don't have the same work ethic. They have, the mindset of a 13-year-old, and turns out that's not quite the same as a 30-year-old. And what do I don't know, right? And I don't claim to know. These are very difficult questions, which is why I go back to my statement. My final statement is we need to focus on the humankind, not just the growth, because the growth is not necessarily the answer. And if we just focus on the growth, we're going to pass by humanity in a way that's scary. Yeah. Yeah. And if you look at long-term forecasts on population growth, we are looking to sort of reach a climax around 2050, and then it's going to start decreasing. We already have countries like Japan where we start to see population growth decrease, and they're starting to worry about how to fill jobs. And these are very specialized economies, so we need to think differently about them. But our concept of population growth is built off of a mindset of an agricultural mindset. It's going to continue to grow because we need to have more kids in order to support the farm. Obviously, we've made that transition here in the US. We've made that transition in many cases. Africa is making that transition now, right? So we still see Africa growing, absolutely, but they're making that transition to start realizing I don't need to have 5 kids in order to have somebody look after me when I'm old. So there is a peak to, again, don't quote me on the numbers, on rough numbers around 2050, where we start to see a peak in population growth, and we'll start to decrease rather than increase. And there are populations like Japan where that's going down already. Yes?
Well, then apparently some research shows that since about 1850, we've been having about if you take immigrants out of the equation, American population is about 1.5 kids per couple.
Okay, so the stat is, if you manipulate it certain ways, it's 1.5 kids. I don't know these numbers, so I can't.
Long story short, outside of immigration, American population has been declining for 150 years.
Okay, so the argument there, aside from immigration, which is a weird one for me to think about, because if I look at immigration, that's the US has grown for the last, 300 years, so it's hard for me to think about what that means, but okay. Other things that so we'll talk about hotels. I think it's really interesting personally, I would go stay in the Howard Johnson or, pick your hotel, and I traveled a fair amount, and I would wake up and go, which city am I in? Like I had to think twice, which city am I currently in, because the hotels all look the same. Right? It turns out I've never yet stayed in an Airbnb that is the same as another, not even sort of. So for me, I'm weird. I really enjoy the variety that I've been able to get through Airbnb, and some of those who follow me on Facebook have seen that. But what's interesting in terms of also is in terms of the what you get, the value proposition when you stay in an Airbnb versus what you stay in a hotel. The fact is, I can get an entire apartment with kitchen facilities and a garage and parking, and I've paid a fraction of it, not a fraction, 80% of the cost or something like that. Now we can all argue, hey, there's advantages, disadvantages. Ultimately, for me, the only point I'm going to make is when does Airbnb become the biggest hotel? And that, to me, is a transition in the accommodation market. It's not what you prefer. Banks. One of you mentioned Bitcoin in terms of a technology that's growing exponentially. The reason Bitcoin is so powerful is that it removes the need for a middle person to identify the transaction as being true or false. And ultimately, that's what a bank does. And so at what point do we start to challenge the banks? And there's lots of interesting questions around banking and Bitcoin. And frankly, banking is very much stuck in an old mind frame and an old set. But you start to see new banks emerging that are just coming online. There's no brick and mortar store, whereas previously banks invested in a brick and mortar store because it was a real estate investment, as well as the fact that it allowed you to see them. We're now in a generation, right? If you're throwing out numbers, I'm making these up. If you're 40 years and older, maybe it was good for you to attract the bank. You like to go deposit your money. If you're a teenager, you don't want to interact with anyone to go deposit money. Like you're actually you're glad to do it at 2 a.m. in the morning. And so we start to see this change in sort of what is required of a bank. Agricultural labor, we've talked about that already. I've already given these numbers. 50% of jobs are at risk of automation and computerization. Again, I'm looking at EU, US, Australia, sort of first world kinds of markets. 60% of current jobs have 30% of tasks that can be performed by computers today. All of you are going, which part can I get rid of? I'm not going to go into the details of industrial revolutions, but one of the things that characteristic about revolutions of the past is that there tended to be a period of time between when the revolution ended and the next one started. It's sort of a stabilization phase that happened. And that's interesting to me. I already mentioned it's characterized by labor. And then there's these sort of three phases that I think we should be aware of. First of all, the Industrial Revolution started with a focus on the haves rather than have-nots. The have-nots probably didn't even know about it, right? It really started with the people who have, the people with the money, the people with the monopolies, the people with the businesses. That's where the revolution started. And again, we're talking about not a revolution of people rebelling, but a revolution of sort of change in the way industry or business worked. If you look at the things you know about today with AI and machine learning and software engineering and programming, it's almost the same. When you go talk to those people who don't know anything about it, it's scary. They don't know what the words mean, so they know what augmented means, they know what reality means, but they don't know what augmented reality means. They know what machine means, they know what learning means, but they don't know what machine learning means. Right? It's this weird world where they just have no concept. And so we should ask the questions. Right? Do we as the haves have access to something that a huge majority of the world doesn't have access to? It tends to mean we got some of the best jobs. I don't know about you, but I certainly think in the software engineering world, it's great. I do not understand why none of my kids think software engineering is cool. It's inconceivable to me. It is obviously the best career. There's no doubt. I don't know what I pushed, and I didn't mean to push it. Stink. The next point I was trying to make is that it changes where people live. This is ridiculous. When the industrial revolutions happened in the past, it moved people out of the farm and into the city. And we saw huge migrations of people into the city to start to do that. One of the interesting questions for me to start asking is, how is the revolution, the inflection point that's happening today, how does that affect us in terms of where we live? And I start to look at sort of the influx of people leaving Silicon Valley to go somewhere else because the cost of living in Silicon Valley is ridiculous. The transformation, and some of you in this room, of saying, hey, I'm going to start working from home. All these types of things which were just not possible in a mechanized world. And so we've already started to see some of that transition. The other thing is to talk about there's a sort of phase where the workers or the common person starts to rebel. They say, hey, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. And it brings to either social change or revolution. And if we look at the Industrial Revolution, we're going to talk about technology, and then the effect that has on people, once it starts to become well known to the common person, one of these two things has to happen. It has to become available so that eventually there can be democratization. An interesting question that I sort of ask as I think about this is say, is it different now in the sense that before the business, those in power needed the employee to do the work. And we're now moving towards where digitization is reducing that need in a pretty significant way, such that we're no longer burdened by paying attention to the rebel. And does that matter? Again, these are not questions I know the answer to. Before you could say the machine gun was extremely motivating. It's hard to compete against a machine gun when you don't have one. But if you still need the person, you can't really destroy them. But then you can start talking about social things that are going on today where we talk about computer vision, recognizing people, and controlling them, knowing where their movements are. You start to wonder, if you don't need the people, do you need to worry about that control? And I don't know the answer. That's loud. There's a book out which I would encourage you to take a look at. It's called Exponential Organizations. And he talks about different phases that you go to in your businesses. The focus of his company is around the top 500 or top 1,000 businesses in the world and how they need to reinvent themselves. And he talks about these 4 phases that they would go through to go do that. I think for us, start looking at our own businesses, we can do the same transitions. And so I encourage you to take a look at a book like this. And then he talks about the fact that successful businesses in these exponential organizations have started to move parts of the business outside. And you look at things like Airbnb and Uber, they've started to move the fact that the actual core part of the business is not part of the business. The taxi is not part of Uber. They've moved that outside. The only thing that they're doing is join the consumer with the provider, with the vendor. And so they're trying to move, there's significant parts of the business that they're trying to externalize from the business itself and focus on being the thing that can't be challenged even by IP. It's not an IP problem, it's a market problem. They have the entire market share. And then internal, what do you need to start bringing internally? There's a couple I want to talk about here. So probably the most interesting to me is that you need to start doing experimentation. Internally, this is where you have to go say, what can I do to, if you don't do that experimentation, it's not going to happen externally, and you're going to be stuck making buggy whips rather than transportation business. So start that experimentation now. Autonomy, this comes from a book called Drive. The fact is you need to allow workers to have autonomy. And that's really important to sort of job satisfaction. And it's totally different than the world that we saw, sort of the previous industrial revolutions, where that was happening. Challenges and opportunities. I look at the whole idea that so much is happening with digitization or expenses moving towards free. And I say somehow that should be raising global income levels, not just for those who are in the 1%. We need to focus our energies on a quality of life of being human-centered, improving humanity, not just on growth. And I do that as a contrast to what happened in, especially sort of the first and second industrial revolution, also the third industrial revolution, where all the wealth was concentrated with the Oppenheimers. It was concentrated with the people that owned the business rather than with the people themselves. And we've seen this sort of focus on is capitalization a word? On capital to the few as being the entire focus. I would recommend. I've recommended one book already. The one Exponential Organizations. The second book I'd recommend is The Fourth Industrial Revolution. I mentioned it earlier. And a third one I'd look at in terms of helping you think through where we're going by looking at history is A People's History of the United States. I'm speaking in the US, so that one's easy to recommend. But it radically transforms the concept of wealth as controlling the people. And this is not your high school history class. So be forewarned, it's written by a socialist, and you should read it with that in mind. But this is not just high school history, but it is something we should think about as we start to look at the future. So the question is, in the past we saw exponential growth initially and then a plateau. And the question, the follow-on one for that is, what do we think is happening today? And my answer is, I have no stinking idea. The exponential stuff is happening so fast today, I can't even conceive of where we will be to even have an understanding of what a plateau means. So even if I said yes and I knew the future, the world is going to be so different in such a short amount of time that I can't even conceptualize what that plateau would be, that I have any meaningful way to do anything with it. Yes?
Are there any trends going away from centralization of wealth? Is wealth actually something that could go away?
So the question was, are there any trends towards centralization of wealth going away? I gave a statistic, I think, earlier. I want to make sure I have the numbers right. Okay, so I don't think I've got exact recollection, but if you go back, so here's statistics from today. Right now, 3 individuals, wealthiest individuals in Africa, own about 50% of the wealth. In the United States, it's about 100, right? I mean, it's a very, very small number. Now, give me leeway of, let's say, 10%, right? I mean, numbers like that. I'm not trying to be very accurate. If you look at world wealth, it's very similar. If you took the wealth of the world, concentration is around the 1%, owns about 48% of the wealth in the world, right? So your question around, hey, is it changing? I don't know. Those stats aren't telling me it's changing very well, right? That's not very.
What's your own income into global richness?
Yeah, so this is thank you for mentioning that, Pat. So what's even more interesting about this is to say, who are we? And so you go to use websites like Global Riches and you put your income in. If you're earning sort of in the $80,000 range, right? Again, plus or minus, a little bit. You're in the top. I was going to say 1%, but I think actually I even think it's lower. Yeah, it's staggering. Now again, we're looking at worldwide wealth, right? So let's be conservative because I don't want to exaggerate the numbers. We say if you're earning $80,000, you're obviously in the 10%, and I think it's around 3 or 5. Pat thinks it's even lower than that. So let's just stick with that number, right? That's staggering. Like that should be overwhelming. As somebody who was just in Haiti, again, 14th poorest country in the world, interacting with people where I had a guide and a driver for my motorcycle. There were 3 of us on the motorcycle for the entire day, and I think I was relatively generous. I paid $40, and when I say generous, I don't mean I was generous because I was definitely not generous. Was I giving them way more than they're earning in a day in that economy? Absolutely. I took them out to lunch. We went to a restaurant, $10 a meal, roughly $15 a meal. I bought them lunch, and I talked to the wait staff. And it took me a long time to find a restaurant. Half an hour, 40 minutes to find a restaurant that we could go to. And I would find, where can we go? Where can we go? Asking everyone, where's the restaurant? Where's the restaurant? Found a restaurant. I didn't have to eat outside. I didn't have to eat on the ground, the dirt. I asked the waitress, and I thought, hey, this is a pretty nice restaurant. She's got a good job. She makes $2 a day. Right? And she had what I think was a job that 90% of Haiti would love to have. And she's making $2 a day. So you're looking at a population right now, I think the number has been 45% of the world population is earning $2.50 or less per day. 48%. That's overwhelmingly, that's ridiculous. Yes. Right, yeah. So the comment was, jobs in Haiti, cleaning toilets, some of the highest paying jobs. It's just scary when you say that, not because it's just highest paying, but because the type of, anyway. Other comments or questions?